12,000 years ago, before the first stone was cut or the first word written, the land that would become Egypt lay quiet beneath a different sky. The Sahara was not yet a desert. Across what is now barren sand, grasslands stretched toward the horizon, fed by seasonal rains that no longer fall. Herds of wild cattle moved slowly across these plains, and scattered bands of hunter-gatherers followed them, tracing paths that had no fixed home, no permanent settlement, only the rhythm of water and season. The Nile, even then, ran through the eastern edge of this world. It was not yet the artery of civilization it would become. It was simply a river, indifferent and constant, cutting a narrow green line through an otherwise unformed landscape. But its presence was already shaping the lives of those who lived near it, pulling them slowly, generation by generation, toward its banks. Around 10,000 BCE, as the climate began to shift, the rains that sustained the grasslands started to fail. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, across centuries rather than lifetimes, the green plains began to dry. The great migration that followed was not sudden. It was not a single dramatic exodus, but a slow drift, family by family, generation by generation, toward the one reliable source of water left in the region. The Nile became not just a river, but a refuge. By around 7,000 BCE, early communities had begun to settle more permanently along its banks. These were not yet the Egyptians of temples and pharaohs. They were farmers and fishers, small family groups who had learned to read the river's moods. They understood, through observation passed down over generations, that once each year the Nile would rise. It would spill beyond its banks, spreading dark, mineral-rich silt across the land, and then recede, leaving behind soil so fertile that seeds pressed into it would grow with little additional effort. This flood was not a disaster to these early people. It was a gift, arriving with such reliability that entire ways of life were built around its rhythm. The Egyptians would later call this inundation Akhet, the season of flooding, and structure their entire calendar around its arrival and departure. But long before there were priests to name the seasons or scribes to record them, there were simply families, watching the water rise, learning when to plant, when to wait, and when to harvest. The earliest crops were emmer wheat and barley, hardy grains suited to the rich alluvial soil the Nile provided. Farmers pressed seeds into the mud left behind by the retreating floodwaters, often using little more than their hands or simple wooden implements. There was no need for elaborate irrigation in these early centuries. The river did the work. It flooded, it receded, and the land was ready. Alongside farming, early Nile communities kept cattle, sheep, and goats. Herds grazed on the marshland grasses that grew abundantly near the riverbanks. Milk, meat, and hide became central to daily survival, supplementing the grains grown in the fields. Fishing, too, played a vital role. The Nile teemed with catfish, tilapia, and perch, and simple reed traps or woven nets allowed families to draw sustenance directly from its waters. These early settlements were modest. Homes were built from mud brick or bundled reeds, materials drawn directly from the riverbank itself. Structures were simple, often circular, or rectangular, with roofs made from palm fronds or woven matting. There was no need yet for grand architecture. Life was organized around survival, around the practical rhythms of planting and harvest, of flood and recession. As centuries passed, these scattered settlements began to grow. By around 5000 BCE, distinct cultural groups had emerged along different stretches of the Nile Valley. In the south, Near what is now Upper Egypt, communities developed distinct pottery styles, burial customs, and social structures. Archaeologists today refer to this culture as the Badarian culture, named after the site where its remains were first identified. The Badarians were among the first to develop more sophisticated approaches to agriculture and craft. Their pottery, though simple, shows early signs of decoration, an emerging aesthetic sense beyond mere function. Burial practices, too, began to grow more elaborate during this period. The dead were placed in shallow pits, often accompanied by simple grave goods, pottery vessels, beads made from shell or stone, occasionally small ivory carvings. These early burials suggest something important, a belief, even in this ancient period, that death was not simply an end. There was a sense, however undeveloped, that the deceased might need provisions for whatever came next. Further north, in the region that would become Lower Egypt, different cultural traditions were taking shape. The Fayum region, with its natural lake fed by Nile floodwaters, supported another distinct farming community. Grain storage pits discovered here reveal careful planning, evidence that these early farmers were not merely surviving season to season, but beginning to think in longer terms, storing surplus grain against future need. This ability to plan, to think beyond the immediate moment, marks a quiet but significant shift in human development along the Nile. It was no longer simply about finding food day to day. Communities were beginning to organize themselves around agricultural cycles, developing systems of storage, exchange, and eventually social hierarchy. By around 4000 BCE, a new cultural phase had emerged in Upper Egypt, known to archaeologists as the Naqada culture. This period saw significant developments that would lay the groundwork for what came later. Naqada settlements grew larger and more complex. Pottery became more refined, often painted with images of animals, boats, and human figures. These early artistic representations offer us our first glimpses into the beliefs and daily life of Nile Valley peoples. Boats appear frequently in Naqada imagery, unsurprising given the central role the Nile played in transportation and trade. Simple reed vessels and later wooden boats allowed communities along the river to connect with one another in ways that had not been possible before. Trade networks began to extend along the length of the Nile, and even beyond, into the eastern desert toward the Red Sea, and westward toward oases that dotted the otherwise barren landscape. Through these trade networks, materials unavailable locally began to appear in Nile Valley settlements. Copper, likely sourced from the Sinai Peninsula, started to be used for tools and ornaments. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges, arrived from distant sources, indicating contact with peoples far beyond the immediate Nile region. Lapis lazuli, A, deep blue stone found only in distant Afghanistan, has been discovered in Naqada period graves, offering remarkable evidence of trade networks stretching across vast distances even in this early period. As trade expanded, so too did social complexity. Naqada period burials show increasing variation in wealth and status. Some graves contain elaborate grave goods, fine pottery, jewelry, and tools, while others remain simple and modest. This variation suggests the emergence of social hierarchy, a class of individuals who held greater wealth, influence, or status within their communities. Alongside this growing social complexity, early forms of leadership began to emerge. Local chiefs, likely responsible for organizing communal labor, particularly around irrigation and floodwater management, began to hold increasing authority. Managing the Nile's floods was not something individual families could handle alone. Cooperation was essential. Canals needed to be dug and maintained, dikes built to control water distribution during flood season, and organized labor required coordination beyond the individual household. It was this practical necessity, the need to manage water collectively, that likely gave rise to some of the earliest formal leadership structures in the Nile Valley. Those who could organize this labor effectively, who could ensure fair distribution of water and land, began to accumulate not just practical authority, but symbolic status as well. By around 3500 BCE, distinct centers of power had begun to emerge along the Nile. Settlements like Nakada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis in the south grew into significant regional centers, each likely governed by increasingly powerful local rulers. These were not yet kings in the sense we would later understand the term, but they represent an important step towards centralized authority. Hierakonpolis, in particular, offers remarkable insight into this period of transition. Archaeological excavations there have revealed evidence of large-scale communal projects, including significant architectural structures that would have required organized labor on a scale beyond simple village cooperation. This suggests the presence of leadership capable of mobilizing substantial numbers of people, likely through a combination of practical authority and emerging religious or symbolic significance. Religion, even in this early period, appears deeply intertwined with the natural world, and particularly with the Nile itself. Early Egyptians observed the river's behavior with careful attention, noting its annual flood, its retreat, the way it shaped the land, and determined the success or failure of each harvest. It is not difficult to understand how such a powerful, life-giving force might come to be seen as divine, or at least deeply connected to divine forces beyond human control. Animal imagery features prominently in the religious and artistic expressions of this period. Cattle, given their central role in daily sustenance, appear frequently, often depicted with reverence suggesting more than mere practical value. Birds, particularly falcons, also appear in early iconography, potentially early associations with concepts that would later develop into recognizable Egyptian deities such as Horus. By the centuries approaching 3200 BCE, the pace of change along the Nile had begun to accelerate. What had been a slow, gradual development over thousands of years now began to show signs of more rapid transformation. Regional centers grew larger, more organized, and increasingly began to interact, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes competitively, with neighboring settlements. It was during this period that the foundations for a truly unified Egyptian civilization began to take shape. The distinct regional cultures that had developed independently along different stretches of the Nile were beginning, slowly, to draw closer together, through trade, through shared religious symbolism, and eventually through political consolidation. Yet all of this, the growing settlements, the emerging leadership, the deepening religious practices, remained fundamentally tied to the same simple, ancient rhythm that had drawn the earliest hunter-gatherers to the Nile's banks thousands of years before. The flood would come, the waters would recede, the fertile black soil would once again be ready for planting. This cycle, repeating endlessly, patiently, across centuries, provided both the practical foundation and the spiritual framework for everything that would follow. As the sun set over the Nile Valley during these early centuries, casting long shadows across mud brick homes and quiet fields, there was, even then, a sense of order, of natural law governing human life. The river gave and the river took. It flooded and it receded. Communities organized themselves around this rhythm, developing increasingly sophisticated social structures, religious beliefs, and eventually political institutions, all in response to the same fundamental relationship between human beings and the great river that sustained them. By the final centuries before 3100 BCE, this slow, patient development had brought Nile Valley society to the threshold of a profound transformation. Regional centers in both the north and south had grown increasingly powerful, increasingly organized, and increasingly aware of one another. The stage was being set gradually, almost imperceptibly, for a moment of unification that would give rise to one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, life along the Nile continued much as it had for generations. Farmers rose with the sun, tended their fields, watched the sky for signs of the coming flood. Fishermen cast their nets into the slow-moving waters. Herders led their cattle to graze along the marshy banks. Children played in the shallow waters near the shore, while elders sat in the shade, sharing stories passed down through countless generations, stories that likely already spoke of the river's power, of its life-giving floods, of the delicate balance between abundance and scarcity that shaped every aspect of daily existence. The world these early Nile Valley communities inhabited was not yet the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs, of grand temples and monumental tombs. It was a quieter world, shaped by patience, by careful observation of natural cycles, by slow accumulation of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Yet within this quiet world, the essential elements of what would become one of history's greatest civilizations were already taking shape. The reliance on the Nile's predictable flooding fostered a deep cultural emphasis on order, cycle, and continuity, values that would later find their fullest expression in Egyptian religion, art, and governance. The early development of social hierarchy, driven initially by practical necessity around water management, laid the groundwork for the centralized authority that would eventually define pharaonic rule. And the deepening religious connection to natural forces, particularly the Nile itself, established spiritual foundations that would persist, in various forms, throughout thousands of years of Egyptian civilization. As twilight settled over the river during these final centuries of prehistory, the water moved on as it always had, dark and steady beneath a darkening sky, carrying with it the accumulated weight of thousands of years of human presence along its banks, and carrying forward, silently, the first quiet promises of the civilization soon to emerge from its fertile embrace. By around 3200 BCE, two distinct spheres of power had solidified along the Nile, each shaped by centuries of separate development. In the south, Upper Egypt stretched along the narrow river valley, its people organized around settlements like Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos. In the north, Lower Egypt spread across the wide, marshy expanse of the Nile Delta, where the river split into multiple branches before reaching the Mediterranean Sea. These two regions, though connected by the same river, had developed different customs, different symbols, and different centers of authority. Upper Egypt's identity became closely tied to the white crown, a tall, conical headpiece that would come to symbolize its rulers. Lower Egypt, by contrast, associated itself with the red crown, a lower, more angular design with a distinctive curling projection at the back. These crowns were not merely decorative. They represented deeply held regional identities, each rooted in centuries of independent cultural development. The vulture goddess Nekbet watched over Upper Egypt from her cult center at El Kab, while the cobra goddess Wajet protected Lower Egypt from her sanctuary at Buto in the delta. These protective deities, one associated with the harsh, narrow valley of the south, the other with the fertile, sprawling marshlands of the north, embodied the distinct character of each region. Even the geography reinforced this division. Upper Egypt was a land of discipline, its settlements strung like beads along a thin ribbon of fertile soil, bordered by unforgiving desert. Lower Egypt was a land of abundance, its delta rich with multiple waterways, marshes, and fertile plains. For generations, these two regions existed as separate political entities, each with its own rulers, its own customs, its own gradual accumulation of power and territory. Yet trade and cultural exchange had long connected them. Boats moved along the Nile's length, carrying goods, ideas, and eventually ambitions between north and south. It was perhaps inevitable that as regional rulers grew more powerful, more organized, more capable of mobilizing resources and manpower, the question of unification would eventually arise. The precise details of how this unification occurred remain, even today, wrapped in a blend of historical fact and symbolic legend. Our clearest window into this pivotal moment comes from a remarkable artifact known as the Narmer palette, discovered in 1898 within the temple complex at Hierakonpolis, carved from a single piece of dark green siltstone, standing just over 2 feet tall. This ceremonial object was likely never intended for practical use. Instead, it served as a commemorative piece, its carved surfaces telling a story in the visual language of the earliest Egyptian art. On one side of the palette, a figure identified through hieroglyphic symbols as Narmer stands tall. Wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, he raises a mace above a kneeling captive, a scene of triumph rendered with careful, deliberate symbolism. Beneath his feet, 2 fallen enemies lie defeated, their bodies drawn with the stylized precision that would come to define Egyptian artistic convention for millennia to follow. On the reverse side, the same figure appears again, but now wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, inspecting rows of bound captives. Between these two scenes, on the palette's upper register, 2 long-necked mythical creatures intertwine, their necks forming a perfect circle. Scholars believe this circle likely once held pigment, suggesting the palette may have originally served a ceremonial function related to cosmetic preparation, perhaps for ritual use rather than daily grooming. The Narmer palette is often interpreted as commemorating the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. Yet historians today understand this unification not as a single dramatic conquest, but as the culmination of a longer process, one that likely unfolded across several generations, involving multiple rulers whose individual contributions have been compressed through the passage of time and the selective nature of historical memory into this singular commemorative moment. Narmer himself, whether he was the final unifier or simply one significant figure within a longer sequence of consolidation, represents a genuine historical transition. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions bearing his name found at sites across both Upper and Lower Egypt, suggests his authority did indeed extend across both regions, even if the precise military and political processes that achieved this remain only partially understood. What followed this unification was the emergence of something genuinely new in human history, a centralized state spanning hundreds of miles along a single river, unified not just by shared language and culture, but by a single ruling authority claiming divine sanction for their power. This new political entity required new administrative structures, new methods of taxation, new systems of resource management, and crucially, a new capital positioned to govern both regions effectively. The location chosen for this new capital reveals careful strategic thinking. Memphis was established near the apex of the Nile Delta, precisely at the geographic point where Upper and Lower Egypt met. This positioning was neither accidental nor merely symbolic, though its symbolic resonance was certainly significant. Memphis sat at the natural crossroads of Egyptian trade and communication, close enough to the Mediterranean to facilitate northern administration, yet positioned to maintain connection with the narrow valley stretching southward. The city's original name, according to later Egyptian tradition, was Ineb Hedge, meaning the white walls, likely referring to whitewashed fortifications that surrounded the earlier settlement. Over subsequent centuries, Memphis would grow into one of the ancient world's great cities, but in these early years following unification, it represented something more. Fundamental, physical proof that Upper and Lower Egypt now existed as a single political entity, governed from a single administrative center. The ruler who sat at the head of this newly unified state occupied a position without clear precedent in human history. Earlier, Nile Valley cultures had developed local chiefs and regional leaders, but the pharaoh, as this figure would come to be known, represented something categorically different. He was not merely a political leader claiming authority through military strength or inherited status. He was, according to emerging Egyptian religious belief, a living embodiment of divine order itself. This concept, which the Egyptians called Mat, represented far more than simple political legitimacy. Mat encompassed truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order, the fundamental principle that maintained harmony between the human world and the divine realm. The pharaoh's role was to embody and maintain this order, ensuring that the Nile continued its life-giving floods, that the sun continued its daily journey across the sky, that the boundary between chaos and civilization remained secure. This was a profound conceptual innovation. Political authority was no longer simply about practical governance, about organizing labor or managing resources. Though these functions remained important, political authority was now fundamentally spiritual, cosmic in scope. The pharaoh existed as an intermediary between the human and divine realms, responsible not just for Egypt's earthly prosperity, but for maintaining the very fabric of cosmic order that prevented the universe from collapsing back into primordial chaos. This religious framework provided remarkable stability to the newly unified Egyptian state. If the pharaoh's authority derived from cosmic necessity, rather than mere political power, then challenging that authority meant challenging the fundamental order of existence itself. This was a powerful ideological foundation, one that would help sustain Egyptian civilization's remarkable continuity across the millennia that followed. Alongside this religious transformation, the practical machinery of governance began to take shape during these early dynastic centuries. The system of writing that would come to define Egyptian civilization, hieroglyphics, had begun to emerge even before unification, likely developing from earlier systems of symbolic representation used to track trade goods and religious concepts. Following unification, this writing system rapidly evolved into a sophisticated tool for administration, religious expression, and historical record-keeping. Scribes, trained in the complex art of hieroglyphic writing, became essential figures within the emerging Egyptian bureaucracy. They recorded harvests, tracked taxation, documented royal decrees, and preserved religious texts. This class of literate administrators represented a crucial innovation, allowing the pharaoh's authority to extend effectively across the considerable distances separating Upper and Lower Egypt, distances that would have been difficult to govern through purely oral communication alone. The economic foundation of this new state rested, as it always had, on agricultural production along the Nile's fertile banks. But unification brought new levels of organization to this ancient practice. Grain, the fundamental currency of Egyptian economic life, could now be collected, stored, and redistributed across a much larger territory. This capacity proved particularly valuable during years when flooding proved insufficient in one region but adequate in another, allowing the unified state to buffer against localized agricultural failures in ways that individual regional governments could not have achieved. Religious practice, too, evolved significantly during this period of consolidation. The various local deities worshipped throughout Upper and Lower Egypt began gradually to merge into a more coherent pantheon, one that acknowledged regional variations while establishing broader religious frameworks that could unite diverse populations under shared spiritual beliefs. Horus, the falcon god long associated with Upper Egyptian kingship, became closely identified with the pharaoh himself, the living ruler understood as Horus's earthly manifestation. This period also saw the establishment of increasingly elaborate royal burial practices, early precursors to the monumental tomb traditions that would later produce Egypt's most famous architectural achievements. Early dynastic rulers were buried in mastaba tombs, rectangular structures with sloping sides constructed from mud brick, containing multiple chambers for the deceased ruler's body, and the substantial grave goods believed necessary for the afterlife journey. At Abydos, considered a particularly sacred site associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife, archaeologists have discovered elaborate royal tombs from this early dynastic period, complete with subsidiary burials of servants and retainers, suggesting the pharaoh's household was believed to continue serving him even beyond death. These burial complexes, while smaller and less architecturally sophisticated than the pyramids that would follow centuries later, reveal the emerging Egyptian preoccupation with death, afterlife, and the elaborate preparations believed necessary to ensure successful transition into the next world. Trade networks expanded significantly during these early dynastic centuries, as the unified state's increased organizational capacity allowed for more ambitious commercial and diplomatic relationships. Expeditions traveled south into Nubia, seeking gold, ivory, and exotic animal skins. Others journeyed toward the Sinai Peninsula, securing access to valuable copper deposits essential for tool and weapon production. Maritime trade along the Mediterranean coast connected Egypt with distant Levantine trading partners, bringing cedar wood from Lebanon, a resource entirely absent from Egypt's own landscape, but essential for shipbuilding and construction. As these first dynasties settled into their governance of unified Egypt, a distinctive cultural identity began to crystallize, one that would persist with remarkable consistency across the following 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. Artistic conventions established during this period, the stylized representation of human figures, the hierarchical use of scale to indicate importance, the careful attention to hieroglyphic inscription accompanying visual imagery, would remain remarkably stable throughout subsequent Egyptian history, evolving gradually, but never abandoning these foundational principles. The concept of the pharaoh as divine intermediary, established during this early dynastic period, would similarly persist across millennia, surviving political upheavals, foreign invasions, and periods of internal fragmentation. Even when Egyptian unity fractured, as it would repeatedly across the centuries that followed, this fundamental religious and political framework remained the ideal toward which subsequent rulers aspired, the model of legitimate authority against which all later claims to power would be measured. By the end of what historians now term the early dynastic period, roughly corresponding to the centuries following 3100 BCE, Egypt had established itself as something genuinely unprecedented, a stable, centralized state spanning hundreds of miles along a single river valley, governed by a ruler whose authority derived from claimed divine sanction, supported by an increasingly sophisticated administrative bureaucracy, and unified by shared religious beliefs, artistic conventions, and economic systems. This was not merely a political achievement, though it was certainly that. It represented a fundamental transformation in how human beings organized themselves, how they understood authority and legitimacy, how they related to the natural forces that shaped their existence, and how they conceived of their place within a cosmic order extending far beyond their immediate physical experience. The Nile continued its ancient rhythm, flooding and receding as it always had. But now that rhythm was understood within a new framework, one that connected the practical necessities of agricultural life with profound questions of cosmic order, divine authority, and the delicate balance between chaos and civilization. As twilight settled over Memphis during these early centuries following unification, the city stood as physical testament to a remarkable transformation. Two previously separate lands, each with their own customs, their own gods, their own rulers, now existed as a single political and spiritual entity, bound together not just by shared geography, but by a shared understanding of cosmic order and divine kingship. The white walls of Memphis rose quietly against the darkening sky, standing at the meeting point of two lands now joined as one, marking the beginning of a civilization that would endure in various forms for nearly 3,000 years to come. By around 2686 BCE, Egypt entered a new era that historians now call the Old Kingdom, a period that would witness the construction of the most enduring monuments in human history. The transition from the early dynastic period was gradual, marked less by dramatic upheaval than by the steady consolidation of royal authority and administrative sophistication that had been developing across the preceding centuries. The third dynasty's founding ruler, Djoser, inherited a kingdom already well organized, but he would oversee an architectural innovation that fundamentally transformed Egyptian civilization's relationship with stone, permanence, and eternity. His vizier and chief architect, a man named Imhotep, conceived of something unprecedented. Rather than constructing the traditional mud brick mastaba tomb, he would build in stone, layer upon layer, creating a structure that rose toward the heavens in a series of diminishing steps. The result, standing at Saqqara near Memphis, was the Step Pyramid, the world's first monumental stone building of its kind, rising roughly 205 feet into the desert sky. This structure represented 6 mastaba-like layers stacked progressively smaller atop one another, an architectural experiment that would establish the fundamental principles guiding pyramid construction for centuries to follow. Imhotep's achievement was so remarkable that he became one of the few non-royal Egyptians ever deified, worshipped in later centuries as a god of wisdom, medicine, and architecture. The Step Pyramid complex extended far beyond the monument itself, encompassing an elaborate funerary complex surrounded by a massive limestone wall nearly a mile in circumference. Within this enclosure, Imhotep designed courtyards, chapels, and ceremonial structures intended to serve Djoser's spirit throughout eternity, recreating in stone the palace architecture the living king had once inhabited. This complex represented far more than a burial site. It embodied the Egyptian belief that death was not an ending but a transition, requiring careful architectural preparation to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey into the afterlife and his continued ability to maintain cosmic order even after physical death. Building upon Djoser's innovation, subsequent pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty pushed pyramid construction toward increasingly ambitious heights. Sneferu, who assumed the throne around 2613 BCE, oversaw the construction of not one, but 3 major pyramids during his reign, each representing crucial steps in the evolution toward the smooth-sided pyramid form that would come to define Egyptian civilization in popular imagination. His final and most successful attempt, the Red Pyramid at Dashur, achieved the first true smooth-sided pyramid shape, standing at approximately 341 feet. Its reddish limestone core still visible today after its outer white casing stones were removed in later centuries. Sneferu's son, Khufu, inherited both his father's architectural ambitions and the accumulated engineering knowledge that made his own project possible. Around 2560 BCE, construction began on what would become the largest pyramid ever built in Egypt, the Great Pyramid at Giza. Rising originally to approximately 481 feet, though erosion and the removal of its capstone have reduced this height slightly over the millennia. This monument represented the absolute pinnacle of Old Kingdom architectural and organizational achievement. The scale of this undertaking remains staggering even by modern standards. The Great Pyramid consists of an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks, each averaging between 2 and 15 tons in weight, though some interior blocks weigh considerably more. These blocks were quarried both locally, from limestone deposits near the Giza Plateau itself, and from more distant sources, including fine white limestone transported from Tura across the Nile, and granite blocks brought from Aswan, some 500 miles to the south. The precise methods used to construct the Great Pyramid remain a subject of ongoing archaeological research, though our understanding has grown considerably in recent decades. Contrary to popular myths suggesting the involvement of enslaved masses, archaeological evidence, including worker villages discovered near the pyramid complex, suggests the labor force consisted primarily of skilled workers and seasonal agricultural laborers, employed during the months when Nile floodwaters made farming impossible, and organized into work gangs with names reflecting a sense of institutional pride and identity. These workers were housed in organized settlements, provided with bread, beer, and meat rations, documented in administrative records discovered at the site. Evidence suggests they received medical care when injured and were buried with dignity in cemeteries near the pyramid complex, their tombs modest but respectful, indicating their labor was valued and their contribution to this monumental project was recognized, even if their names have largely been lost to history. The engineering precision achieved during this construction remains remarkable. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within just a few centimeters across its entire 13-acre footprint, and its 4 sides are oriented with such accuracy toward true north that they deviate by only fractions of a degree. Achieving this level of precision required sophisticated understanding of astronomy, geometry, and surveying techniques, knowledge accumulated across generations of Egyptian architectural experimentation. Surrounding the Great Pyramid, subsidiary structures completed the funerary complex. Smaller pyramids housed the burials of Khufu's queens, while a network of temples, causeways, and boat pits supported the elaborate rituals believed necessary to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition into the afterlife. A ceremonial boat, discovered disassembled in a sealed pit near the pyramid, was reconstructed in the 20th century, revealing the sophisticated woodworking techniques Egyptian craftsmen had mastered, and offering insight into the belief that the pharaoh would need such a vessel to traverse the heavens alongside the sun god Ra. Nearby, Khufu's son Khafre constructed his own pyramid, slightly smaller than his father's, but positioned on higher ground, creating an illusion of similar height when viewed from certain angles. Alongside this pyramid, Khafre commissioned what would become one of history's most recognizable monuments, the Great Sphinx, a massive limestone statue combining a lion's body with a human head, likely modeled after Khafre himself, standing guard over the pyramid complex with an expression of serene, eternal vigilance. The construction of these monuments required an administrative apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. Organizing the labor, materials, and resources necessary for such projects demanded careful coordination across multiple government departments, each responsible for different aspects of the massive undertaking. Granaries needed to be stocked to feed thousands of workers. Quarries needed to be operated efficiently, with skilled stonemasons cutting blocks to precise specifications. Transportation networks needed to move these enormous blocks from quarry to construction site, often utilizing the Nile itself during flood season, when boats could navigate closer to the construction area than during lower water periods. This level of organizational capacity reflects the broader administrative sophistication that characterized Old Kingdom governance. The pharaoh sat atop an increasingly complex bureaucratic hierarchy, with viziers overseeing various government departments, provincial governors called nomarchs administering local regions, and an extensive network of scribes maintaining the records necessary to coordinate such ambitious projects across the length of the Nile Valley. Religious practice during this period continued to evolve, with the cult of Ra, the sun god, growing increasingly prominent alongside older beliefs. The pharaoh's identity became increasingly associated with Ra, particularly through the title Son of Ra, reflecting a theological framework that positioned the living ruler as both earthly administrator and divine intermediary, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that ensured the sun's continued journey across the sky and the Nile's continued life-giving floods. Yet even as these monumental achievements reached their zenith, subtle signs of change were beginning to emerge within Old Kingdom society. The immense resources required for pyramid construction, resources that had once flowed almost entirely toward royal projects, gradually began to be redirected toward other purposes. Provincial nomarchs, initially appointed as royal administrators, began accumulating hereditary authority within their regions, gradually transforming their positions from temporary royal appointments into powerful local dynasties with increasing independence from central authority. This gradual decentralization occurred alongside a slow reduction in the scale of royal pyramid construction. Later, Old Kingdom pharaohs, while still commissioning pyramid complexes, built structures considerably smaller and less architecturally ambitious than those of the Fourth Dynasty. This shift likely reflects both changing religious priorities and the practical reality that provincial authorities were retaining increasing portions of Egypt's agricultural wealth that had previously flowed towards centralized royal projects. Around 2181 BCE, following the lengthy reign of Pepi II, who may have ruled for over 60 years according to later Egyptian tradition, the delicate balance that had sustained Old Kingdom stability began to unravel entirely. Climate evidence suggests this period coincided with a series of insufficient Nile floods, a devastating development for a civilization so entirely dependent on the river's predictable annual inundation. Reduced flooding meant reduced agricultural yields, which meant reduced tax revenue flowing towards central government, which further weakened the pharaoh's ability to maintain the elaborate administrative and religious systems that had sustained Egyptian unity for over 4 centuries. As central authority weakened, provincial nomarchs, already possessing considerable local power, began asserting increasing independence. Egypt fragmented into competing regional territories, each governed by local rulers claiming varying degrees of authority, some still nominally acknowledging the pharaoh's overlordship, others operating with near-complete autonomy. This period, which historians term the First Intermediate Period, represents roughly a century and a half of political fragmentation, though it would be inaccurate to characterize this era as simple chaos or civilizational collapse. Egyptian culture, religious practice, and artistic tradition continued throughout this period of political fragmentation, adapted to regional variation but maintaining fundamental continuity with earlier Old Kingdom traditions. Literature from this period, including texts that reflect on themes of social upheaval and uncertainty, suggests contemporary Egyptians experienced this fragmentation as a significant disruption to the cosmic and social order they had come to expect. Yet the underlying cultural and religious framework that had developed during the Old Kingdom persisted, providing continuity even amid political division. Gradually, over the course of several generations, regional powers began competing for dominance, with 2 centers emerging as particularly significant: Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. This competition eventually resolved in favor of Theban rulers, whose gradual military and political consolidation, achieved across multiple generations rather than through any single decisive campaign, eventually succeeded in reunifying Egypt under a single royal authority once again. The pharaoh credited with achieving this reunification, Mentuhotep II, ascended to power in Thebes around 2055 BCE, initially as a regional ruler, but gradually extending his authority northward across subsequent decades of his lengthy reign. By approximately 2046 BCE, Mentuhotep had successfully reunified Egypt, establishing what historians now recognize as the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a new period of centralized authority, artistic achievement, and cultural confidence. This reunification, while significant, was achieved through a different process than the original unification some 1,000 years earlier. Rather than the emergence of an entirely new administrative and religious framework, Mentuhotep's reunification represented a restoration, a return to centralized authority built upon foundations that Old Kingdom civilization had already established. The concept of divine kingship, the administrative structures of provincial governance, the religious frameworks connecting pharaonic authority to cosmic order. All these elements persisted through the fragmentation of the First Intermediate Period, ready to be restored once a sufficiently powerful ruler emerged capable of reasserting centralized control. Mentuhotep's successors continued consolidating this restored unity, gradually rebuilding the administrative sophistication that had characterized Old Kingdom governance, while incorporating lessons learned from the fragmentation that had followed the Old Kingdom's collapse. Middle Kingdom pharaohs proved notably more attentive to maintaining balanced relationships with provincial authorities, recognizing that the unchecked accumulation of regional power had contributed significantly to the previous period's political fragmentation. This renewed stability created conditions for significant achievements in irrigation and agricultural development. The Fayum region, southwest of Memphis, received particular attention during this period, with ambitious water management projects expanding cultivable land and increasing agricultural productivity beyond what the natural Nile flood alone could support. These projects reflected a Middle Kingdom approach to governance that emphasized practical infrastructure development alongside the religious and monumental architectural traditions inherited from earlier centuries. Literature flourished during this period as well, with Middle Kingdom texts often exploring themes of social order, personal morality, and reflection on the proper relationship between rulers and subjects, themes that likely reflected broader cultural processing of the fragmentation and reunification that had defined the preceding century and a half. These literary works, preserved on papyrus and through later copies made by subsequent generations of scribes, offer remarkable insight into the intellectual and philosophical concerns of Middle Kingdom Egyptian society. As the Middle Kingdom progressed through subsequent dynasties, trade networks re-established and expanded, reconnecting Egypt with Nubian territories to the south and Levantine trading partners along the Mediterranean coast. Expeditions once again ventured toward Punt, a distant land whose precise location remains debated among historians, but which likely lay along the Red Sea coast of modern Somalia or Eritrea, bringing back incense, exotic animals, and luxury goods that reinforced Egyptian prosperity and international connection. By the close of what historians recognize as the Middle Kingdom's early flourishing, Egypt had successfully navigated its first major period of political fragmentation, emerging with renewed stability, while carrying forward the fundamental religious, administrative, and cultural frameworks established during the Old Kingdom's remarkable pyramid-building centuries. The lessons learned during this cycle of unity, fragmentation, and restoration would prove significant, establishing patterns of resilience and cultural continuity that would enable Egyptian civilization to weather similar challenges across the many centuries still to come. By around 1985 BCE, the 12th dynasty emerged under Amenemhat I, a ruler whose origins likely lay outside the traditional royal bloodline, having served as a vizier before ascending to the throne himself. This transition of power, achieved through what appears to have been legitimate succession rather than violent usurpation, nonetheless prompted Amenemhat to take deliberate steps to reinforce the stability and legitimacy of his new royal line. One of his most significant decisions involved relocating Egypt's administrative capital away from Thebes, the southern city that had spearheaded the Middle Kingdom's reunification, toward a new location he established near the entrance to the Fayum region. This new capital, called Ijtawi, though its precise archaeological location remains somewhat uncertain even today, positioned Egypt's government more centrally within the kingdom, better able to oversee both Upper and Lower Egypt, while remaining closely connected to the ambitious agricultural development projects underway in the nearby Fayum Depression. Amenemhat also introduced an important political innovation designed to prevent the kind of succession disputes that had contributed to earlier periods of instability. He established a system of co-regency, formally elevating his son Senusret I to share royal authority, while Amenemhat himself remained alive, ensuring a smooth, unambiguous transition of power when the elder pharaoh eventually died. This practice of co-regency, though not without precedent, became notably more systematic during the 12th dynasty, providing a mechanism for peaceful succession that would influence Egyptian royal practice for generations to come. Senusret I, upon assuming full authority following his father's death around 1962 BCE, continued the pattern of careful, methodical governance that would characterize the 12th dynasty more broadly. Military campaigns extended Egyptian influence southward into Nubia, securing access to valuable gold deposits and establishing fortified settlements along the Nile's southern reaches to protect these strategic economic interests. These fortresses, constructed with sophisticated defensive architecture, represented significant investments in maintaining Egyptian control over lucrative trade routes connecting the Nile Valley with the resources of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fayum Development Project, initiated under Amenemhat and continued by his successors, represented one of the Middle Kingdom's most impressive achievements in practical infrastructure engineering. This natural depression, connected to the Nile by a channel that Egyptian engineers gradually modified and expanded, contained a substantial lake that could be managed to regulate water levels according to agricultural needs. During periods of high Nile flooding, excess water could be diverted into this lake, reducing flood damage to surrounding areas. During drier periods, water could be released from the lake back toward agricultural land, providing a buffer against the natural variability of the Nile's annual inundation. This project reflected a broader Middle Kingdom philosophy of governance that emphasized practical problem solving, alongside the religious and monumental architectural traditions inherited from earlier centuries. While 12th dynasty pharaohs certainly continued pyramid construction, their monuments, built primarily at sites like Dashur and Lisht, generally employed less resource-intensive construction techniques than the massive stone projects of the Old Kingdom, often utilizing mud brick cores with limestone casing, a pragmatic approach that achieved impressive visual results while requiring considerably less labor and material investment than earlier pyramid traditions. Amenemhat III, who ascended the throne around 1860 BCE, oversaw perhaps the fullest realization of the Fayum Development Project's potential. Under his direction, the water management infrastructure reached its most sophisticated form, and agricultural productivity within the region expanded significantly, supporting population growth and economic prosperity throughout this portion of the Middle Kingdom. Amenemhat III's reign is often considered the high point of 12th dynasty stability and prosperity, a period when Egyptian governance had successfully synthesized the administrative lessons learned from the first intermediate period's fragmentation, with renewed confidence in centralized royal authority. Trade and diplomatic relationships flourished during this period of stability. Egyptian expeditions maintained regular contact with Levantine trading partners along the Mediterranean coast, while southern trade routes continued bringing gold, ivory, and exotic goods from Nubian territories. Archaeological evidence, including Egyptian artifacts discovered at sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean, suggests Egypt's cultural and economic influence extended considerably beyond its immediate borders during this period, establishing networks of trade and diplomatic contact that would continue evolving throughout subsequent centuries. Literary culture reached remarkable heights during the Middle Kingdom, producing texts that would be copied and studied by Egyptian scribes for over 1,000 years following their original composition. The Tale of Sinuhe, perhaps the most celebrated literary work from this period, follows the story of an Egyptian official who flees into voluntary exile following political upheaval, eventually finding success and status among foreign peoples before ultimately returning to Egypt in his old age. This narrative, rich with reflection on identity, belonging, and the deep emotional connection Egyptians felt toward their homeland, offers remarkable insight into the values and concerns of Middle Kingdom society. Religious literature also flourished during this period, with texts like the coffin texts inscribed on the interior surfaces of wooden coffins, providing deceased individuals with spells and instructions believed necessary for successful navigation of the afterlife. These religious texts represented a significant democratization of afterlife beliefs, that had previously been largely restricted to royal burial practices during the Old Kingdom, suggesting broader Middle Kingdom access to religious knowledge and afterlife preparation extending beyond the immediate royal family. As the 12th dynasty progressed through subsequent generations, however, gradual changes began reshaping Egypt's political and demographic landscape. Changes that would eventually contribute to another period of fragmentation. The eastern Nile Delta, positioned at Egypt's frontier with the Levant, had long served as a natural point of contact between Egyptian civilization and neighboring Canaanite peoples. Throughout the Middle Kingdom, gradual migration brought increasing numbers of Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant into this delta region, some arriving as traders, others as agricultural laborers, still others potentially as prisoners captured during military campaigns. This gradual demographic shift, occurring over multiple generations, eventually contributed to the emergence of a distinct population within the Eastern Delta that maintained cultural and religious practices reflecting their Levantine origins, while operating within the broader framework of Egyptian administrative and economic systems. Historians today refer to these peoples as the Hyksos, though this term, derived from an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands, was applied by later Egyptian sources, rather than representing how these peoples might have identified themselves. As 12th dynasty royal authority gradually weakened during the 13th dynasty, a period characterized by increasingly rapid succession of pharaohs, many of whom ruled for remarkably brief periods, the Delta's Hyksos population began asserting increasing political independence. By approximately 1650 BCE, Hyksos rulers had established their own royal dynasty, governing from a capital at Avaris in the eastern delta, while acknowledging little meaningful subordination to whatever remained of centralized Egyptian authority further south. This period, which historians term the Second Intermediate Period, witnessed Egypt's second major experience of political fragmentation, though its character differed significantly from the earlier First Intermediate Period. Rather than fragmentation into competing Egyptian regional powers, this division involved a foreign-influenced northern kingdom existing alongside a southern Egyptian kingdom centered once again at Thebes, creating a genuinely bicultural political landscape that would prove significant in shaping subsequent Egyptian historical memory and identity. The Hyksos rulers, despite their foreign origins, adopted many elements of Egyptian royal culture, taking Egyptian throne names, worshipping Egyptian deities alongside their own traditional gods, and maintaining administrative practices inherited from earlier Egyptian governance. This cultural synthesis reflects a broader pattern that would recur throughout Egyptian history, wherein foreign rulers, rather than imposing entirely alien governmental and religious systems, frequently sought legitimacy by adopting and adapting existing Egyptian traditions of divine kingship and administrative practice. Significantly, the Hyksos period also introduced important technological innovations that would prove consequential for subsequent Egyptian military development. Evidence suggests Hyksos rulers introduced the horse-drawn chariot to Egypt, along with improved bronze-working techniques and new weapon designs, technologies that had been developing throughout the broader Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, but hadn't previously been extensively adopted within Egyptian military practice. Meanwhile, in the south, Theban rulers maintained their claim to legitimate pharaonic authority, governing a reduced but still significant Egyptian kingdom that stretched along the Nile Valley south of the Hyksos-controlled Delta region. These Theban rulers, while initially maintaining relatively peaceful, if uneasy, coexistence with their northern Hyksos counterparts, gradually began contemplating military action aimed at reunifying Egypt under southern, ethnically Egyptian leadership. The pharaoh Seqenenre-Tao, ruling from Thebes around 1560 BCE, appears to have initiated more active military confrontation with Hyksos authority, though the precise circumstances remain debated among historians. Archaeological evidence, including his mummified remains which show severe head wounds consistent with battle injuries, suggests Seqenenre may have died in combat, potentially during early conflicts with Hyksos forces, though whether this occurred during formal battle or a more isolated confrontation remains uncertain. His successor, Kamosi, continued and apparently intensified military efforts against Hyksos authority, launching campaigns that pushed Egyptian forces northward toward the Delta region. Inscriptions from Kamosi's reign describe successful military actions against Hyksos territory, though these campaigns fell short of achieving complete reunification before Kamosi's own reign ended, leaving this ambitious project of restoration to his successor. That successor, Ahmose I, would ultimately achieve what his father and brother had begun, completing Egypt's reunification through a sustained military campaign that historians estimate occurred sometime around 1550 BCE. Ahmose's forces, employing the same chariot and bronze weapon technologies that Hyksos rulers had originally introduced to Egypt, successfully captured Avaris, the Hyksos capital, forcing surviving Hyksos leadership to retreat from Egyptian territory entirely, likely withdrawing toward Canaanite territories in the Levant, from which their ancestors had originally migrated generations earlier. This military triumph, achieved through patient, multi-generational effort, spanning the reigns of Seqenenre-Tao, Kamose, and finally Ahmose himself, marked far more than simple political reunification. It represented the establishment of an entirely new phase in Egyptian civilization, one that emerged from the experience of foreign rule and military struggle with heightened emphasis on military strength, expanded territorial ambition, and a more assertive approach to Egypt's relationship with neighboring civilizations. The psychological and cultural impact of the Hyksos period on subsequent Egyptian civilization should not be underestimated. Having experienced foreign rule within their own delta territory, and having achieved reunification only through sustained military campaign, Egyptian rulers emerging from this period carried forward a heightened awareness of the importance of military preparedness and territorial security. This awareness would fundamentally shape the character of the New Kingdom period that followed, an era that would witness Egypt's transformation from a civilization primarily focused on internal development and stability toward one actively pursuing imperial expansion across neighboring territories. Ahmose I, having achieved reunification, moved quickly to consolidate his authority and establish the administrative and religious frameworks that would define this new era. He rebuilt temples that had suffered neglect or damage during the preceding period of division, reasserted traditional Egyptian religious practices throughout the reunified kingdom, and began establishing the military and administrative structures that his successors would develop into one of the ancient world's most formidable and expansive empires. The Nile continued its ancient rhythm throughout these tumultuous decades of division and reunification, flooding and receding according to its eternal pattern, indifferent to the human political struggles playing out along its banks. Yet the Egypt that emerged from this second period of fragmentation and restoration was subtly but significantly different from the Egypt that had experienced the earlier collapse of Old Kingdom authority. This new Egypt carried forward not just administrative and religious continuity, but also new military technologies, heightened territorial awareness, and an emerging confidence that would soon express itself through unprecedented imperial expansion across the ancient Near East. Following Ahmose I's reunification of Egypt around 1550 BCE, His successors inherited both the military infrastructure and the territorial ambitions that would define what historians now recognize as the New Kingdom, a period often regarded as the pinnacle of Egyptian imperial power and cultural achievement. This era, spanning roughly 5 centuries, would witness Egypt transform from a regionally focused river valley civilization into an empire commanding influence across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, ruling in succession following Ahmose's reign, continued consolidating Egyptian authority while beginning to extend military campaigns beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Thutmose I in particular pushed Egyptian forces deep into Nubian territory to the south, while also launching campaigns northward into the Levant, reaching as far as the Euphrates River, an unprecedented extension of Egyptian military reach that established patterns of imperial ambition subsequent pharaohs would continue developing. It was Thutmose III, however, who would come to embody the new kingdom's imperial character most fully. Ascending to the throne as a young child around 1479 BCE, his early reign was overshadowed by his stepmother Hatshepsut, who assumed the role of pharaoh herself rather than merely serving as regent, an extraordinary development that would make her one of history's most remarkable female rulers. Hatshepsut's reign, lasting approximately 2 decades, defied conventional expectations of Egyptian kingship in ways that continue fascinating historians today. Rather than pursuing military conquest, she focused her considerable resources on ambitious construction projects and expanded trade relationships. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs across the Nile from Thebes, represents one of ancient Egypt's most architecturally sophisticated achievements, its terrace design blending seamlessly with the natural limestone cliffs surrounding it. She also commissioned a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, documented in detailed relief carvings within her mortuary temple that depict exotic goods including myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and live animals being transported back to Egypt. These carvings provide remarkable visual documentation of ancient Egyptian trade relationships extending far beyond the Nile Valley, offering glimpses into distant lands and peoples that Egyptian expeditions encountered during this period of confident, prosperous governance. Following Hatshepsut's death around 1458 BCE, Thutmose III finally assumed full, unshared authority and quickly demonstrated the military ambition that would earn him recognition among historians as one of history's greatest military commanders. Over the course of numerous campaigns spanning roughly 2 decades, Thutmose III led Egyptian forces through the Levant with remarkable strategic sophistication, most notably at the Battle of Megiddo, where his forces defeated a coalition of Canaanite rulers through a bold tactical decision to advance through a narrow, seemingly indefensible mountain pass that his enemies had left unguarded, assuming no rational commander would attempt such a route. This victory, and the numerous campaigns that followed, established Egyptian control over much of the Levant, creating an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Conquered territories were incorporated into Egyptian administrative systems through a combination of direct governance and indirect control through local vassal rulers who acknowledged Egyptian authority while retaining considerable autonomy over internal affairs, a pragmatic approach to imperial administration that allowed Egypt to control vast territories without requiring the resources necessary for complete direct governance. The wealth generated through this expanded empire, flowing into Egypt through tribute, trade, and the direct exploitation of conquered territories' resources, funded increasingly ambitious construction projects throughout Egypt, particularly at Thebes, which had become the new kingdom's primary religious and political center. The temple complex at Karnak, dedicated primarily to the god Amun, who had risen to prominence as Egypt's preeminent deity during this period, expanded dramatically under successive New Kingdom pharaohs, eventually becoming the largest religious complex ever constructed in the ancient world. Successive generations of pharaohs added new halls, pylons, obelisks, and sanctuaries to Karnak, creating an architectural palimpsest that visually documented centuries of New Kingdom religious devotion and political power. The hypostyle hall alone, constructed primarily during later New Kingdom reigns, contains 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows, some rising over 70 feet in height, their surfaces covered with intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions and religious imagery that would have created an overwhelming sense of divine presence for ancient visitors moving through the dim, incense-filled spaces between these towering stone columns. Amenhotep III, ascending to the throne around 1391 BCE, presided over perhaps the New Kingdom's most prosperous and culturally sophisticated period, an era when Egyptian military dominance had created such stability that his reign could focus primarily on cultural, artistic, and diplomatic achievement rather than continued military campaign. Diplomatic correspondence discovered at Amarna, written on clay tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, the international diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, reveals Egypt's extensive diplomatic relationships with other major powers of the period, including Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. These diplomatic letters exchanged between Amenhotep III and various foreign rulers discuss matters ranging from royal marriages and gift exchanges to more serious concerns about regional political stability, offering remarkable insight into the sophisticated international diplomatic networks that connected major Near Eastern powers during this period. Egypt's position within this network reflected its status as the preeminent power of the age, with foreign rulers frequently seeking Egyptian diplomatic support, military assistance, or marriage alliances with Egyptian royal women, though Egyptian pharaohs themselves rarely reciprocated by sending their own daughters in marriage to foreign courts. A diplomatic asymmetry reflecting Egypt's perceived superiority within this international system. It was Amenhotep III's son, however, who would introduce the most radical religious and cultural transformation of the entire New Kingdom period. Ascending to the throne around 1353 BCE under the name Amenhotep IV, this pharaoh would soon initiate changes so profound that later Egyptian tradition would attempt to erase his memory almost entirely from official historical record. Early in his reign, Amenhotep IV began elevating the worship of the Aten, a solar deity represented as the sun disk itself, above the traditional Egyptian pantheon, including Amun, whose priesthood at Karnak had grown so wealthy and politically powerful that some historians suggest this religious transformation may have been motivated partly by political considerations, an attempt to reduce the temporal power of an increasingly independent priestly establishment that potentially rivaled royal authority itself. Around 1346 BCE, this religious transformation intensified dramatically. The pharaoh changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and abandoned Thebes entirely, relocating Egypt's capital to a newly constructed city built on previously unoccupied desert land roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis. This new capital, called Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, was designed from its foundation to serve as the center of this new, radically monotheistic religious practice that Akhenaten sought to establish throughout Egypt. The artistic style that emerged during this period, now known as Amarna art, after the modern name for this archaeological site, departed dramatically from centuries of established Egyptian artistic convention. Royal figures were depicted with unusually elongated features, exaggerated curves, and an intimacy of family representation that contrasted sharply with the formal, idealized royal imagery that had characterized Egyptian art for over 1,000 years. Akhenaten himself is frequently shown in tender family scenes with his primary wife Nefertiti and their daughters, embracing and kissing in compositions that emphasize emotional connection rather than distant royal formality. Nefertiti's own role during this period appears to have been remarkably significant, with artistic and textual evidence suggesting she held religious and political authority considerably beyond what Egyptian queens had traditionally exercised. Some scholars have suggested she may have eventually ruled independently, possibly even as a female pharaoh following Akhenaten's death, though the precise details of succession during this chaotic transitional period remain among the most actively debated questions in Egyptological research. The religious revolution Akhenaten attempted proved ultimately unsustainable, lasting only through his roughly 17-year reign, before beginning to unravel following his death around 1336 BCE. His successors, including the young pharaoh who would become known to history as Tutankhamun, gradually restored traditional Egyptian religious practice, abandoning Akhetaten and returning Egypt's capital and religious center to their traditional locations at Thebes and Memphis. Tutankhamun's own reign, though relatively brief and largely overseen by powerful advisors given his young age at ascension, holds extraordinary significance for modern historical understanding due to the remarkable preservation of his tomb, discovered largely intact in 1922. This discovery provided unprecedented insight into New Kingdom royal burial practices, revealing the astonishing wealth of grave goods that accompanied royal burial, including the iconic golden funerary mask that has become perhaps the single most recognizable artifact from ancient Egyptian civilization. The systematic restoration of traditional religious practice continued under Tutankhamun's successors, particularly Horemheb, a military commander who assumed the throne following the brief reigns of Tutankhamun's immediate successors, and who worked deliberately to erase Akhenaten's religious revolution from official historical memory, ordering the dismantling of Amarna period monuments and the removal of Akhenaten's name from official king lists, an attempt at historical erasure that succeeded so thoroughly that Akhenaten's reign remained almost entirely unknown to modern historians until archaeological rediscovery of Amarna period materials in the 19th and 20th centuries. Following this period of religious upheaval and restoration, Horemheb's successor established what would become the 19th dynasty, founded by a military commander who took the name Ramses I, establishing a new royal line that would produce some of ancient Egypt's most famous and militarily accomplished pharaohs, rulers who would work to restore and even expand upon the imperial achievements of earlier New Kingdom rulers like Thutmose III, while navigating an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape shaped by the emergence of new regional powers, particularly the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, whose growing strength would soon bring them into direct confrontation with Egyptian imperial ambitions in the Levant. As this chapter of New Kingdom history draws toward its close, Egypt stood as an empire transformed by nearly 2 centuries of military conquest, religious experimentation, and cultural achievement. The traditional gods had been challenged and ultimately restored. the boundaries of Egyptian influence had expanded to encompass much of the eastern Mediterranean world, and the stage was set for the emergence of pharaohs, whose names would become synonymous with Egyptian imperial grandeur in the centuries still to come. Following Horemheb's death, around 1292 BCE, the throne passed to Ramses I, a military commander whose brief reign served primarily to establish the foundations for what would become one of ancient Egypt's most consequential royal dynasties. Though he ruled for likely no more than 2 years, Ramses I successfully positioned his son, Seti I, to inherit an increasingly stable and militarily capable kingdom, one poised to reassert Egyptian imperial authority throughout the Levant, following the religious upheavals and diplomatic uncertainties of the preceding Amarna period. Seti I, ascending to the throne around 1290 BCE, moved quickly to restore Egypt's military presence throughout territories that had grown increasingly contested during the transitional years following Akhenaten's religious revolution. His campaigns into the Levant brought Egyptian forces into direct contact with the Hittite Empire, whose expanding influence throughout Anatolia and northern Syria had begun encroaching upon territories Egypt had traditionally considered within its own sphere of imperial control. Beyond military achievement, Seti I invested considerable resources into religious construction, most notably beginning work on the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, a project his son would eventually complete, and constructing his own mortuary temple at Abydos, renowned even today for the exceptional quality and preservation of its relief carvings, which display a refinement and artistic sophistication that many historians consider among the finest examples of New Kingdom religious art. It was Seti I's son, however, who would come to embody the 19th dynasty's imperial ambitions most fully, and whose reign would extend so long and prove so consequential that later Egyptian tradition would remember him simply as Ramses the Great. Ascending to the throne around 1279 BCE, Ramses II would rule for an extraordinary 66 years, a reign so lengthy that he would outlive several of his own designated heirs before finally being succeeded by his 13th son. Early in his reign, Ramses II turned his attention toward resolving the ongoing territorial disputes with the Hittite Empire that his father had begun addressing. Around 1274 BCE, this rivalry culminated in the Battle of Kadesh, fought near the Orontes River in modern Syria, one of the largest chariot battles in recorded ancient history, involving thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of soldiers from both Egyptian and Hittite forces. The battle itself proved militarily inconclusive, with both sides claiming victory in their respective historical records, though modern historical analysis suggests the engagement likely ended in a strategic stalemate that neither side could definitively claim as decisive triumph. Ramses II, however, commissioned extensive temple reliefs throughout Egypt, depicting the battle as a personal triumph of his own courage and military leadership, describing how he single-handedly rallied his forces after being nearly surrounded by Hittite chariots, a narrative that, whether entirely accurate or considerably embellished for propaganda purposes, became a central element of his carefully constructed royal image throughout the remainder of his lengthy reign. Perhaps more historically significant than the battle itself was its ultimate diplomatic resolution. Around 1259 BCE, after continued tension and sporadic conflict throughout the intervening years, Ramses II and the Hittite king, Hattusili III, negotiated what historians recognize as one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in recorded human history. This agreement, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, established formal peaceful relations between the two empires, including provisions for mutual defense against common enemies and the extradition of political refugees, demonstrating a level of sophisticated international diplomacy remarkable for its historical period. This peace was further reinforced through diplomatic marriage, with Ramses II eventually marrying a Hittite princess, cementing the alliance between these two great powers through the kind of dynastic connection that had long characterized diplomatic relationships throughout the ancient Near East. This treaty ushered in a period of relative peace and stability throughout the region, allowing both empires to focus resources on internal development rather than continued costly military confrontation. With this external security established, Ramses II turned increasingly toward ambitious construction projects that would leave an indelible mark on Egypt's landscape and historical memory. He completed the great hypostyle hall at Karnak that his father had begun, its massive columns and intricate reliefs celebrating both religious devotion and military achievement in equal measure. He constructed a new capital city in the eastern delta called Pyrameses, positioning Egypt's administrative center closer to the Levantine territories that remained central to Egyptian strategic and economic interests. Perhaps his most visually spectacular achievement, however, lies far to the south, at Abu Simbel, near Egypt's border with Nubia. Here, Ramses II commissioned two massive rock-cut temples carved directly into sandstone cliffs overlooking the Nile. The larger temple's facade features four colossal seated statues of Ramses himself, each standing approximately 65 feet tall, their serene, monumental expressions gazing eternally across the river landscape below. This temple was deliberately oriented so that twice each year, during the equinoxes, sunlight would penetrate deep into the temple's inner sanctuary, illuminating statues of Ramses seated alongside several Egyptian deities, a remarkable feat of astronomical and architectural precision that continues to attract visitors to this remote location even today. Adjacent to this grand temple, Ramses constructed a smaller companion temple dedicated to his beloved wife, Nefertari, whose own colossal statues appear alongside those of her husband on the temple facade, an unusual and significant honor reflecting the genuine affection and respect Ramses appears to have held for this particular queen among his numerous wives. Nefertari's own tomb, discovered in the Valley of the Queens, contains some of the most exquisitely preserved and artistically sophisticated wall paintings from the entire New Kingdom period, their vibrant colors and delicate detail offering remarkable insight into the aesthetic sensibilities of this prosperous era. Throughout Egypt, Ramses II's name and image appeared on monuments of every scale, from massive temple complexes to smaller commemorative stelae, reflecting both his personal ambition and the genuine prosperity that characterized much of his exceptionally long reign. His extensive building program, while impressive, also reflected practical political calculation, reinforcing his authority and legacy through the kind of monumental permanence that had characterized Egyptian royal expression since the earliest pyramid-building centuries of the Old Kingdom. Following Ramses II's death around 1213 BCE, after outliving so many potential heirs that succession itself became a notable historical curiosity, his son, Merneptah, inherited a kingdom that, while still powerful, would soon face challenges of a fundamentally different character than the organized state warfare that had characterized earlier New Kingdom military conflicts. Merneptah's reign coincided with early evidence of a broader pattern of instability spreading throughout the eastern Mediterranean world, as various groups, collectively referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, began appearing along Egypt's borders and coastal territories. The precise origins and identity of these sea peoples remain among the most actively debated questions in ancient Near Eastern historical Yenju, with scholars proposing various theories involving displaced populations from the Aegean, Anatolia, and other Mediterranean regions, possibly fleeing broader patterns of climate disruption, economic collapse, or political upheaval that seem to have affected multiple civilizations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. Merneptah successfully repelled an early incursion of these groups, commemorating his victory in inscriptions that also contain the earliest known historical reference to Israel, offering valuable, if brief, insight into the broader demographic and political landscape of the Levantine region during this transitional period. The challenges Merneptah faced, however, proved merely a preview of more severe difficulties confronting his successors. Ramses III, ascending to the throne around 1186 BCE as the founder of the 20th dynasty, would face what historians consider among the most serious external threats in New Kingdom history, as Sea Peoples' migrations intensified dramatically, contributing to the collapse of several major Bronze Age civilizations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, including the Hittite Empire itself, whose sudden disappearance from historical record around this period remains one of ancient history's most striking examples of civilizational collapse. Ramses III successfully defended Egypt against these existential threats through a combination of naval and land battles. Commemorated in detailed relief carvings at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu that depict dramatic scenes of combat against Sea Peoples' forces, including what may represent one of history's earliest recorded naval battles. These victories, while significant, came at considerable cost, straining Egyptian military and economic resources during a period when broader regional instability was already disrupting traditional trade networks and diplomatic relationships throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. Beyond these external military pressures, Ramses III's reign also reveals growing internal economic strain. Administrative records from this period document what historians consider history's earliest recorded labor strike, when workers at the royal necropolis, frustrated by delayed grain payments reflecting broader economic difficulties, refused to continue their work until proper compensation was provided. This incident offers a remarkable insight into the practical economic pressures affecting even privileged royal workers during this increasingly challenging period, suggesting that the wealth and stability that had characterized earlier New Kingdom prosperity was beginning to erode under the combined pressures of military conflict, disrupted trade networks, and possibly broader climate-related agricultural challenges affecting Nile flood patterns. Ramses III's own death, occurring around 1155 BCE, was itself surrounded by conspiracy and violence, as later investigation revealed a harem conspiracy involving one of his secondary wives who sought to place her own son on the throne rather than the legitimate designated heir. This palace intrigue, documented in surviving trial records, reveals the internal political tensions simmering beneath the surface of continued royal authority, even as external pressures from Sea Peoples' migrations and broader regional instability continued challenging Egypt's traditional imperial position. The pharaohs who followed, collectively known to history simply as Ramses IV through Ramses XI, presided over a period of gradual but persistent decline in centralized royal authority. Egyptian control over Levantine territories, once extending as far as the Euphrates during the height of Thutmose III's conquests, gradually contracted as the broader regional instability of this period made maintaining distant imperial possessions increasingly impractical and costly. Nubian gold mining operations, once a crucial source of royal wealth, appeared to have experienced declining productivity, further straining royal finances during this challenging transitional period. Perhaps most significantly, the priesthood of Amun at Karnak, whose wealth and influence had grown substantially throughout the New Kingdom's imperial centuries, began accumulating political authority that increasingly rivaled and eventually superseded traditional pharaonic power, particularly in Upper Egypt. By the reign of Ramses XI, the high priest of Amun had effectively become an independent political authority governing much of southern Egypt, while the pharaoh's practical authority remained increasingly confined to Lower Egypt and the traditional administrative centers around Memphis and the eastern delta. This gradual fragmentation of centralized authority, occurring not through single dramatic collapse, but through decades of slow, incremental erosion, brought the New Kingdom to its eventual conclusion around 1077 BCE, when Ramses XI's death marked the end of unified pharaonic authority as it had existed since Ahmose I's reunification some 5 centuries earlier. Egypt would soon divide between northern rule centered at Tanis in the delta and southern authority effectively governed by Amun's priesthood at Thebes, initiating what historians recognize as the Third Intermediate Period. Yet even as this political fragmentation unfolded, the fundamental religious, cultural, and administrative frameworks that had developed across the preceding centuries of New Kingdom imperial grandeur persisted, carried forward through temple institutions, scribal traditions, and deeply embedded cultural practices that would continue shaping Egyptian civilization, even as political unity once again gave way to regional division. The great monuments Ramses II and his predecessors had constructed throughout Thebes, Abydos, and Abu Simbel remain standing testament to an era of unprecedented imperial achievement, their weathered stone facades beginning that long, slow transition from living centers of active religious devotion toward the silent, monumental presence they would maintain across the millennia still to come, patient witnesses to whatever transformations Egyptian civilization would yet experience. Following the death of Ramses XI around 1077 BCE, Egypt entered a period of political division that historians term the Third Intermediate Period, characterized by a fundamental split in authority between the Delta region in the north and Thebes in the south. In the north, a new dynasty established its capital at Tanis, while in the south, the high priests of Amun at Karnak continued exercising effective governing authority, creating a genuinely divided kingdom that would persist in various forms for several centuries. This division, though significant, did not represent complete civilizational collapse. Religious practice continued largely uninterrupted. Temple construction and maintenance persisted, though generally at reduced scale compared to the ambitious projects of earlier New Kingdom pharaohs, and the fundamental administrative and cultural frameworks that had developed across the preceding centuries remained largely intact, even as centralized political authority fragmented along regional lines. Around 945 BCE, a significant shift occurred when Libyan military leaders, whose ancestors had gradually settled within Egyptian territory over preceding generations, established a new ruling dynasty. Sheshonq I, founder of this 22nd dynasty, successfully reunified Egypt under a single royal authority, ruling from a capital at Bubastis in the eastern delta. This Libyan-descended dynasty, despite its foreign origins, quickly adopted traditional Egyptian religious and administrative practices, following patterns of cultural integration that had characterized previous instances of foreign rule throughout Egyptian history. Sheshonq I is notably mentioned in biblical tradition, identified by many scholars with the Pharaoh Shishak reference in the Hebrew Bible, as having campaigned against the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, providing a rare point of potential correlation between Egyptian historical records and biblical narrative that continues generating scholarly interest and debate regarding the precise historical relationships between these ancient societies. This Libyan dynasty's authority, however, proved less stable than earlier periods of centralized Egyptian rule. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt had again fragmented into competing regional power centers, with multiple simultaneous claimants to royal authority ruling different portions of Egyptian territory, a period of division that created conditions ripe for external intervention from Egypt's southern neighbor, the increasingly powerful Kingdom of Kush. Kush, centered in the region of ancient Nubia, along the Nile south of Egypt's traditional borders, had developed its own sophisticated civilization, deeply influenced by centuries of Egyptian cultural and religious contact, yet maintaining distinct political and cultural traditions of its own. Around 727 BCE, the Kushite king Piye, taking advantage of Egypt's internal fragmentation, launched a military campaign northward, ultimately conquering Egyptian territory and establishing Kushite rule over the entire Nile Valley, from Nubia through the Delta. Piye and his successors, who together constituted Egypt's 25th dynasty, presented themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of traditional Egyptian religious and cultural values, positioning their rule as a return to authentic pharaonic tradition, following what they characterized as a period of decline and fragmentation under previous Libyan-descended rulers. This Kushite dynasty invested significantly in temple restoration and construction throughout Egypt, particularly at Thebes, where they worked to revitalize religious institutions that had experienced neglect during preceding decades of political instability. Taharqa, perhaps the most notable Kushite pharaoh, oversaw an extensive building program throughout Egypt and Nubia during his reign beginning around 690 BCE, constructing monuments that deliberately echoed earlier Egyptian architectural traditions while incorporating distinct Kushite artistic elements, creating a genuinely synthesized cultural expression that honored Egyptian religious tradition while maintaining connection to Kushite royal identity and heritage. This period of Kushite rule, however, brought Egypt into direct confrontation with an emerging power whose influence would soon extend throughout much of the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire, having developed sophisticated military organization and technology, particularly effective siege warfare capabilities and coordinated large-scale military campaigns, had been steadily expanding westward from its Mesopotamian heartland, eventually bringing Assyrian forces into direct territorial contact with Kushite-controlled Egypt. Beginning around 674 BCE and intensifying through subsequent decades, Assyrian forces launched repeated invasions into Egyptian territory, eventually succeeding in driving Kushite rulers back toward their traditional Nubian territories and establishing at least nominal Assyrian authority over Egypt itself, though this control proved difficult to maintain, given the considerable distance separating Egypt from the Assyrian imperial center in Mesopotamia. This period of Assyrian domination, while significant, proved relatively brief. Local Egyptian rulers, particularly those governing from the Delta city of Sais, gradually reasserted Egyptian independence as Assyrian imperial resources became increasingly strained by simultaneous military commitments across their vast empire. Psamtik I, founder of what historians recognize as the 26th or Side dynasty, successfully achieved full Egyptian independence around 664 BCE, initiating what many historians consider a genuine renaissance of traditional Egyptian culture and political stability. The Side dynasty period witnessed a deliberate cultural and artistic revival, with Egyptian artists and architects consciously studying and reproducing artistic styles from earlier periods of Egyptian history, particularly drawing inspiration from Old Kingdom artistic conventions, in what appears to have been a deliberate attempt to reconnect with and reaffirm traditional Egyptian cultural identity following the political disruptions of the preceding centuries of foreign domination. This period also saw increasing Egyptian engagement with the broader Mediterranean world, particularly through expanding contact with Greek civilization. Greek merchants and mercenaries became increasingly common presences within Egyptian society, with the Side pharaohs establishing a Greek trading colony at Naucratis in the western delta, creating a significant point of cultural and economic exchange between Egyptian and Greek civilizations that would prove historically significant for developments still centuries in the future. Despite this period of renewed stability and cultural confidence, Egypt increasingly found itself operating within a broader geopolitical landscape dominated by rising Near Eastern powers whose military and political ambitions extended over increasingly vast territories. Following the Assyrian Empire's eventual collapse in the late 7th century BCE, a new power emerged to dominate the region, the Persian Empire, under the leadership of the Achaemenid dynasty. In 525 BCE, Persian forces under Cambyses II successfully invaded and conquered Egypt, incorporating the ancient civilization as a satrapy, a provincial territory, within the vast Persian imperial system that already encompassed much of the Near East, extending from Mesopotamia through Anatolia and into Central Asia. This period, which historians term the First Persian period or 27th dynasty, represented a fundamentally different experience of foreign rule than Egypt had previously encountered, as Persian administrators generally maintained more direct oversight rather than allowing the kind of cultural integration and adoption of Egyptian traditions that had characterized earlier periods of foreign rule. Persian rule, while generally maintaining Egyptian administrative structures and permitting continued religious practice, nonetheless represented a significant reduction in Egyptian political autonomy, with ultimate authority resting with Persian governors answerable to the distant imperial court, initially at Persepolis and later at other Persian administrative centers. This arrangement generated persistent Egyptian resistance, with periodic rebellions attempting to reassert Egyptian independence throughout the following century and a half of Persian domination. Around 404 BCE, Egyptian rebels succeeded in temporarily expelling Persian authority, establishing a series of native Egyptian dynasties, the 28th through 30th dynasties, that maintained independence for approximately 60 years. This period, though relatively brief, witnessed renewed temple construction and cultural expression, including some of ancient Egypt's final great architectural achievements built under native pharaonic authority, before Persian forces successfully reconquered Egypt around 343 BCE, initiating what historians term the Second Persian period. This second period of Persian control, however, would prove considerably shorter than the first, as broader geopolitical transformations already underway throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world were about to fundamentally reshape the region's political landscape. In Macedonia, a young king named Alexander had inherited his father Philip's kingdom, and his ambitious plans for military expansion against Persian imperial authority. Alexander's campaign against the Persian Empire, beginning in 334 BCE, achieved rapid and remarkable success, defeating Persian forces in a series of decisive battles that exposed the vulnerabilities of an empire that had grown vast but increasingly difficult to defend against Alexander's innovative military tactics and highly disciplined Macedonian forces. Following his victory at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander turned his attention toward Egypt, arriving in 332 BCE, to find a population apparently eager to welcome him as liberator from Persian domination, rather than as conqueror. Egyptian priests and officials, having endured over a century of intermittent Persian rule marked by cultural and religious tension, embraced Alexander's arrival, crowning him pharaoh in traditional religious ceremony at Memphis, formally incorporating him within the ancient framework of divine Egyptian kingship that had persisted since the earliest dynastic period nearly 3,000 years earlier. Alexander, demonstrating the kind of cultural sensitivity that characterized his broader approach to governing conquered territories throughout his empire, embraced this traditional Egyptian religious framework, presenting himself as a legitimate pharaoh rather than merely foreign military conqueror. During his relatively brief time in Egypt, Alexander made a decision that would prove enormously consequential for the region's subsequent history, founding a new city along the Mediterranean coast that would bear his name. Alexandria, established in 331 BCE, at a strategically valuable location connecting Egypt with broader Mediterranean trade networks, was designed from its foundation according to sophisticated Greek urban planning principles, featuring wide, geometrically organized streets and monumental public architecture that would soon establish the city as one of the ancient world's great intellectual and commercial centers. Alexander departed Egypt to continue his broader military campaigns against remaining Persian territories, never returning to the land he had so briefly but significantly transformed. His subsequent death in Babylon in 323 BCE, at just 32 years of age, left his vast empire without clear succession, initiating decades of conflict among his former generals as they struggled to divide and consolidate control over the territories Alexander had conquered. Among these successor generals, Ptolemy, who had served as one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, moved quickly to secure control over Egypt specifically, recognizing the strategic and economic value this ancient, wealthy civilization represented. By 305 BCE, Ptolemy had formally declared himself pharaoh, establishing what would become the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek Macedonian royal line that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, representing the final chapter of pharaonic Egyptian civilization before its eventual absorption into the expanding Roman world. This Ptolemaic period would witness remarkable cultural synthesis between Greek and Egyptian traditions, the flourishing of Alexandria as perhaps the ancient world's greatest center of learning and scholarship, and ultimately the final dramatic chapter of independent Egyptian political authority, embodied in the historical memory of Egypt's last great and most famous female pharaoh, whose story would bring this ancient civilization's political independence to its poignant, historically significant conclusion. Following Ptolemy I Soter's formal establishment of Egyptian royal authority in 305 BCE, the dynasty he founded would rule for nearly 3 centuries, presiding over a civilization that blended Greek administrative and cultural practices with deeply rooted Egyptian religious and artistic traditions. Ptolemy himself, having witnessed firsthand the immense wealth and strategic value Egypt represented during his years serving alongside Alexander the Great, moved deliberately to establish Alexandria not merely as Egypt's political capital, but as a center of intellectual and cultural achievement that would eventually surpass even Athens in scholarly prestige. Central to this ambition was the Library of Alexandria, established during Ptolemy I's reign and expanded significantly by his successors, particularly Ptolemy II Philadelphus. This institution, attached to the broader Mausion, a research center dedicated to the Muses, sought to collect and preserve the totality of human knowledge available during the ancient world. Scholars and scribes worked systematically to acquire texts from throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, employing methods that included copying borrowed manuscripts and, according to some historical accounts, occasionally requiring ships docking at Alexandria's harbour to surrender any books aboard for copying before their eventual return. The scholarly community that gathered at Alexandria during the Ptolemaic period included some of antiquity's most significant intellectual figures. Euclid, whose systematic approach to geometry established mathematical principles still taught today, worked and taught within this environment. Eratosthenes, serving as the library's chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using only geometric reasoning and observations of shadow angles at different latitudes. Physicians at Alexandria conducted anatomical studies that advanced medical understanding considerably beyond previous Greek and Egyptian traditions, benefiting from the unique intellectual environment where Greek philosophical inquiry could combine with ancient Egyptian medical and embalming knowledge accumulated across millennia. Alexandria's physical landscape reflected this intellectual ambition. The lighthouse of Alexandria, constructed on the island of Pharaohs near the harbour entrance during Ptolemy I's reign and completed under his son, rose to a height historians estimate at over 350 feet, making it one of the ancient world's tallest structures and eventually earning recognition as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its light, produced through fire reflected by polished bronze mirrors, guided ships safely into Alexandria's busy harbour, serving as both practical navigational aid and powerful symbol of the city's prominence within Mediterranean trade and cultural exchange. The Ptolemaic rulers, despite their Greek Macedonian origins, worked deliberately to establish legitimacy within traditional Egyptian religious and political frameworks. They adopted pharaonic titles, commissioned temple construction throughout Egypt in styles consistent with ancient Egyptian architectural tradition, and positioned themselves within the same divine kingship framework that had legitimized Egyptian rulers since the earliest dynastic period nearly 3,000 years earlier. The temple complex at Edfu, dedicated to the god Horus and constructed primarily during the Ptolemaic period, represents one of the best preserved examples of ancient Egyptian temple architecture precisely because of this dynasty's careful attention to maintaining traditional religious practice and architectural convention. This careful cultural balancing act reflected the fundamental challenge facing Ptolemaic rule throughout its nearly 3-century duration, governing a population whose religious and cultural traditions extended back millennia, while maintaining the Greek Macedonian identity and administrative practices that connected the ruling dynasty to the broader Hellenistic world emerging from Alexander's conquests. Greek remained the primary language of administration and elite culture, particularly within Alexandria itself, while Egyptian religious and cultural traditions continued largely unbroken throughout the rest of the country, particularly in rural areas and among the broader population. Following Ptolemy II's reign, subsequent generations of Ptolemaic rulers gradually encountered increasing challenges, maintaining the stability and prosperity that had characterized the dynasty's early decades. Succession disputes, often involving considerable palace intrigue and occasionally violent conflict between rival claimants to the throne, became increasingly common as the dynasty progressed through subsequent generations. These internal political tensions gradually weakened Ptolemaic Egypt's position relative to the emerging power that would eventually determine the kingdom's ultimate fate, the Roman Republic. Rome's influence throughout the Mediterranean world had been expanding steadily throughout the centuries following Alexander's death, as Roman military and political power gradually absorbed or subordinated the various Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from the fragmentation of Alexander's empire. By the 1st century BCE, Ptolemaic Egypt, despite maintaining nominal independence, had become increasingly dependent on Roman diplomatic and military support to maintain internal stability, particularly during periods of succession crisis or internal political conflict. It was within this context of gradual Roman ascendancy and Ptolemaic political vulnerability that Cleopatra VII, the dynasty's final and most historically significant ruler, ascended to the Egyptian throne in 51 BCE, initially ruling alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, in accordance with Egyptian royal tradition that typically paired male and female co-rulers, often through marriage between siblings, a practice reflecting ancient Egyptian religious concepts regarding divine kingship, rather than merely political convenience. Cleopatra quickly demonstrated political sophistication and ambition that distinguished her from many of her Ptolemaic predecessors. Fluent not only in Greek, her dynasty's traditional language, but also reportedly in Egyptian and several other languages relevant to diplomatic and administrative affairs, she positioned herself carefully within both Greek and Egyptian cultural and religious frameworks, presenting herself to her Egyptian subjects as an incarnation of the goddess Isis, while maintaining the Greek cultural sophistication expected of Ptolemaic royalty within the broader Hellenistic Mediterranean world. Her early reign proved politically turbulent, involving conflict with her brother and co-ruler that eventually drew Roman intervention when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, pursuing his own political rival Pompey during the broader civil conflict that was reshaping Roman political authority during this period. Caesar's presence in Alexandria coincided with and significantly influenced the resolution of Cleopatra's internal political conflict, ultimately resulting in her brother's death and Cleopatra's establishment as Egypt's effectively sole ruling authority, supported by her relationship with Caesar himself, a relationship that produced a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra would present as evidence of divine favor connecting Egyptian and Roman political authority. Following Caesar's assassination in Rome in 44 BCE, Cleopatra navigated the resulting political chaos with characteristic strategic sophistication, eventually forming a political and personal alliance with Mark Antony, one of the three Roman leaders who emerged to divide authority over Rome's vast territories following Caesar's death. This alliance, formalized through their relationship beginning around 41 BCE, represented Cleopatra's attempt to secure Egyptian independence and influence through careful diplomatic and personal engagement with Rome's internal political competition. For nearly a decade, this alliance between Cleopatra and Antony provided Egypt with relative stability and continued prosperity, even as broader Roman political tensions gradually intensified between Antony and his rival Octavian, who would eventually become known to history as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Antony and Cleopatra's relationship produced several children, and involved genuine political and military cooperation, with Antony relying significantly on Egyptian resources and support for his own military campaigns throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while Cleopatra sought to leverage this Roman alliance to expand and secure Egyptian territorial and political interests. This delicate balance of power ultimately collapsed as tensions between Antony and Octavian escalated into open civil conflict, culminating in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, fought off the coast of Greece between Antony and Cleopatra's combined naval forces and those commanded by Octavian. This battle proved decisive, with Octavian's forces achieving clear victory, forcing Antony and Cleopatra to retreat back toward Egypt with their remaining forces significantly diminished and their broader political position substantially weakened. Octavian pursued his defeated rivals to Egypt itself, arriving with Roman forces in 30 BCE to complete his victory and eliminate any remaining resistance to his consolidating authority over Rome's vast territories. Facing this overwhelming military pressure, an understanding that continued resistance offered little realistic hope of maintaining Egyptian independence or her own political authority. Antony took his own life following false reports of Cleopatra's death, believing his cause entirely lost. Cleopatra, upon learning of Antony's death and recognizing the hopelessness of her own political and military position, chose to end her own life rather than face the humiliation of capture and display as a defeated enemy within Octavian's eventual triumphal procession through Rome. Ancient historical sources, though written considerably after these events and reflecting varying degrees of political bias, generally describe her death as occurring through the bite of an asp, a venomous snake she reportedly arranged to have smuggled into her presence, though the precise historical accuracy of these accounts remains uncertain given the limitations of surviving contemporary documentation. Her death in 30 BCE marked the definitive end of Ptolemaic rule, and more broadly, the conclusion of nearly 3,000 years of pharaonic Egyptian civilization, stretching back to Narmer's unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Octavian, having achieved complete victory over his Roman political rivals, formally incorporated Egypt as a Roman province, ending the ancient tradition of Egyptian rule by rulers claiming legitimate pharaonic authority and divine kingship that had persisted through numerous periods of both indigenous and foreign governance since the earliest dynastic period. Yet even as Egypt's independent political existence concluded with Cleopatra's death, the deeper cultural and religious traditions that had developed across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization did not simply vanish. Temple worship continued throughout the early centuries of Roman administration. Egyptian religious practices gradually blended with and influenced broader Mediterranean religious traditions, and the accumulated scholarly knowledge preserved within Alexandria's libraries and intellectual institutions continued influencing broader Mediterranean and eventually European intellectual development for centuries following Egypt's political incorporation into Roman imperial territory. The Nile continued its ancient rhythm, flooding and receding according to the same eternal pattern that had first drawn scattered hunter-gatherers toward its fertile banks some 10,000 years before Cleopatra's death. Temples that Ptolemaic rulers had constructed in careful imitation of ancient pharaonic tradition stood alongside monuments dating back to Old Kingdom pyramid builders, Middle Kingdom administrators, and New Kingdom imperial conquerors, physical testament to the remarkable continuity and adaptability that had allowed Egyptian civilization to persist, transform, and endure across a span of human history, unmatched by almost any other ancient civilization. As twilight settled over Alexandria's harbour in the years following Cleopatra's death, the great lighthouse continued its steady illumination, guiding ships safely toward a city that would continue serving as an important centre of Mediterranean commerce and scholarship for centuries to come, even as the political independence and pharaonic tradition it had once served quietly passed into history, leaving behind monuments, texts, and cultural achievements that would continue speaking across the millennia to come, carrying forward the memory of a civilization built along the patient, eternal waters of the Nile.